The debate about communism is as old as the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, who discussed this idea in ancient times. In Plato's Republic, he proposes to prohibit the private possessions of material goods and even communize the family. Aristotle, in his work Politics, undertakes an examination of Socrates' political proposals, stating that Plato's ideas are harmful to the state and that they prohibit the individual from developing to his or her full potential. However, it was Karl Marx who developed communism into a popular idea. He wrote these ideas together with Friedrich Engels in a pamphlet known as the Communist Manifesto, which is at the center of our debate. Communism is a political economic doctrine that aims to replace private property and a profit-based economy with public ownership and communal control of at least the major means of production, mines, mills, and factories, and the natural resources of a society. Giving up private property and handing all possessions to the state takes a great amount of discipline and persuasion. Therefore, it is not surprising that heated debates, panic, even war, can result in conflict between communism and capitalism. It can be argued that the debate and policies written as a result are between communism, a utopia that goes against human nature to possess things on one side, and capitalism on the other. In the 1840s, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, it was becoming necessary to protect the working population from slavery on one hand and increasing production and creating more jobs and salaries on the other. The ideas of communism was appealing to the working class, which was already exploited. The average worker worked 14 hours a day. Women were expected to work just as hard for less pay, and children too were cruelly exploited. The workers lived in fear of losing their jobs and hunger. In light of this, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels gained a supportive audience. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two German philosophers and critiques of political economy, met in Paris and formed a lifelong friendship and professional collaboration, resulting in the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848. After attending a conference of the Communist League, Marx and Engels were asked to write a document that summarizes their ideas and philosophy, creating one class of people with 10 main goals that include abolition of property and land, progressive income tax, canceling of all rights of inheritance, confiscation of property of rebels, centralization of credit by means of the national bank, centralization of communication and transportation, state-owned factories, cultivation of waste and improvement of the soil, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, free education for all children in public school, abolition of children's factory labor. The manifesto concludes with the words, "Working men of all countries, unite." Even though the Communist Manifesto and the name Marx are symbolic to the ongoing debates around the concept of communism and the so-called reason behind the implementation of communist regimes, the manifesto itself had no immediate impact as the European Revolution began in 1848 with the working class retaliating against the monarchies. This attempt failed and the working class was driven into repression. Furthermore, in the 1850s and 1860s, capitalism progressed, proving Marx and Engels' predictions wrong. It was not until about 80 years later that the Communist Manifesto had its greatest impact on the world. The debate between capitalism and communism took a violent and crucial turn during the Russian Revolution of 1917. This was the beginning of what was to become the feared communist dictatorship of the USSR. This revolution started as a series of unrests between the imperial government and the working class. The Bolsheviks and their leader Vladimir Lenin, who was a revolutionary Marxist, seized power and destroyed the tradition of Tsarist rule. For the first time, the debate around communism led to a violent overturning of a regime and implementation of a violent totalitarian policy. The Bolshevik Revolution from 1917 to 1921 was known as the period of war communism. In this period, the government took control of all private land, industry, and small businesses. During this same period, as a result of the dictatorship forming in the USSR, the USA developed an increased paranoia towards communism and Marxism, seeing it as the opposite of a free society. This debate between the capitalist USA and the communist USSR was the foundation of the Cold War. In the USA, the debates on communism were not so much about the socio-economic idea behind Marx and Engels' manifesto versus capitalism. As the preferred path for the American society, they were concentrated on the good American way versus the evil communist and Russian dictatorship. The fear of a Bolshevik takeover in the USA after World War I brought about policies that sparked debate among civil rights groups and the US government. The Palmer raids were conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice in 1919 and 1920. They wanted to arrest foreign anarchists, communists, and radical leftists, many of whom were then deported. The raids, fueled by social unrest following World War I, were led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and are viewed as the climax of that era's so-called Red Scare. Palmer was ambitious to obtain the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1920 and believed that he could establish himself as the law and order candidate. Together with a young J. Edgar Hoover, Palmer created the General Intelligence Division in the FBI. He was able to get an increase in funds from Congress to devote to anti-communist activities by the Justice Department. Also, at that time, the House Un-American Activities Committee was created, also known as HUAC. In all, the Palmer raids arrested more than the number of warrants that had been obtained from the courts. Many of those arrested were guilty of nothing more than having a foreign accent. As news of the brutality of the raids became public, and the constitutionality of the actions was brought into question, many, including the National Civil Liberties Bureau, publicly challenged Palmer's actions. Palmer's unfulfilled predictions of a May Day 1920 revolution and an attempt of a Bolshevik overthrow of the government destroyed his credibility with the public, diminishing the Red Scare and ending the Palmer raids. In 1946, after the end of World War II, the Cold War began. At this point in history, the world was divided into East Bloc, communist dictatorships, and the West Bloc, capitalist social democracies. The main debate and the policies implemented by the two blocs were made very clear by the approaches of Truman and Stalin. The Americans, led by Truman, the first Cold War president, and the British both feared the impact of the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and they also feared the threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties gaining power in the democracies of Western Europe. The Soviets, led by Stalin on the other hand, were determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe, and they were intent on spreading communism worldwide, largely for ideological reasons. The Cold War had solidified by 1947 to 1948. The U.S. diplomacy shifted to influence other countries to stand beside the United States as a front against the Russian expansion. For example, the Marshall Plan, which brought U.S. aid to war-torn Western Europe, influenced these countries to stand with the USA. Meanwhile, the Soviets had shifted their diplomacy to openly install communist regimes in Eastern Europe. As a result of the split between East Bloc and West Bloc, the United States has implemented a series of policies such as Executive Order 9835, known as Loyalty Order, by Truman in 1947. These orders allowed HUAC to go hard against Hollywood and arrest filmmakers, writers, producers, etc. From 1950 to 1954, a dark period in America known as McCarthyism started. McCarthy was a junior senator from Wisconsin who used and abused the fear of communism to gain power and fame. Again, the debate was not whether communism was a relevant form of governing or how to implement the useful ideas from this ideology. It was whether you are an American or a communist. In 1950, the Subversive Activity Control Act was created. Thousands of alleged communist sympathizers were arrested and harassed by law enforcement. They were isolated from friends and family and fired from their jobs. This was known as the Red Scare, and has continued to influence political debate in the decades since. Ironically, McCarthyism ended after an ABC News report of a court case, Army versus McCarthy, which sparked heated debate amongst Americans about civil rights such as the First Amendment. The ideology of communism, presented by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, is a utopia. The practical implementation of these principles, social diplomacy and laws that protect and empower the citizen against abuse. Although Marx and Engels failed in the prediction of a communist revolution and the collapse of capitalism, and although the communist regime of the USSR collapsed and the Cold War is over, the major successes of the Communist Manifesto is the altered awareness of the political world and the increase of social laws and international diplomacy, ranging from free education to global environmental acts. Minimum wage, social security, food stamps, free public education, and much more are some of the great successes harvested from the debate on communism. The ongoing debate on how to implement the principles of communism is the biggest impact of the Communist Manifesto. On the other hand, even though Karl Marx is known as one of the most influential figures in history, unfortunately, his ideas on communism are still erroneously used by opportunists as a word synonymous to anti-American.